Dawn had not yet arrived, but the darkness was no longer whole. The eucalyptus forest skirting Sydney Cove lay beneath a dim grey light of the pre-dawn hour. Mist clung to every branch, every stone, every breath of the earth, like a sacred veil being drawn by ancestral spirits to hide something moving beneath it. A British soldier stood guard at the entrance of the camp. He never believed in spirits, never believed in omens, never believed in anything except the flintlock musket in his hands. But that morning, or rather that gloomy moment before sunrise, he felt something strange. Not a sound, not a sight, just a feeling, as if someone was watching him through the mist. He squinted, trying to peer deeper into the thick bush ahead. Nothing. Only tall grey trunks, leaning like giant figures frozen in place. The mist drifted like smoke. Darkness blended with pale light, turning the whole forest into a hazy sea. Then he heard it. A sound so faint that if a breeze had passed, it would have swallowed it whole. A sound not like an animal, not like wind, but like someone's breath. The soldier strained his eyes again. He saw nothing. But the one watching him saw everything. In the scrub, only a few dozen paces away, a pair of dark eyes glimmered in the shadows. Not the eyes of a predator, the eyes of a human, but not just any human. Eyes that had witnessed countless wet seasons and dry seasons, that knew the language of the land, that recognised the footprints of every ancestral spirit. Those eyes belonged to Pemulwuy. The soldier did not know that name, but the land knew. The Bidjigal people knew. The Eora elders knew. And only a few months later, the British would know too. That name would thunder across the clear sky, like a spear slicing through the night, like a ghost appearing and disappearing in a heartbeat. Pemulwuy, the warrior chosen by Mother Earth, the warrior whom even lead bullets could not bring down. And right now, he stood in the mist, silently watching the trembling soldier who had no idea why fear had crept into his bones. Here, in that moment of stillness, history was shifting. The soldier did not know that he had just glimpsed the shadow of a legend, a man who would terrify the mightiest empire of the age for more than a decade. The man the British would call by many names. The Phantom, the Black Spirit, the man who cannot die. But the Eora called him by a sacred name. Pemulwuy, the one who comes from Mother Earth. Before the white ships arrived from afar, this land was a world of raw, breathing life. Endless stretches of bushland, morning lyrebirds singing ancient melodies, and each gust of wind sweeping through the gums like the whisper of ancestors. Aboriginal people did not see land as something to own. Land was their mother, the place where ancestral beings shaped the world in the Dreamtime. Dreamtime, the time of dreams, was the root of every story, every ceremony, every step of their ancestors. The Eora believed those ancestors still lived here, in every river, every stone, every streak of fire through the open woodland. Each clan was simply entrusted with the duty to care for that sacred land. So when the British arrived, raised a flag and proclaimed the land terra nullius, nobody's land, it was more than a land grab. It was an insult to the ancestors, a tearing of a sacred bond older than memory itself. To the Eora, the land was not empty. The British were simply ignorant. Pemulwuy grew up in that world, one where every tree had a name, every rock had a story, and every breeze carried the reminders of ancient spirits. He was unusual from a young age. People said his left eye had a cloudy ring, as if he saw life through two realms, the realm of the living and the realm of the ancestors. His feet were slightly turned, a sign that the clan believed marked him as a clever man, one sent by the Dreamtime with a special purpose. No one in the clan doubted Pemulwuy's destiny. He was not born for an ordinary life. He was born to protect, When Botany Bay first lit up beneath the white sails, Pemulwuy stood on a high rock and watched without speaking. He sensed what others could not. Those ships carried not just strangers, but irreversible change. The British built camps, then fences, then they chopped trees, hunted animals, dug through earth. Shell middens, vital food sources, were destroyed. Sacred forest patches were violated. They shot kangaroos not out of hunger, but for sport. Each gunshot did not just kill an animal, it tore another thread from the dreamtime. The Eora tried to communicate. They drew symbols, pointed out paths, offered food. But the British did not understand the language of the land. They only understood the law of empire. Then it happened. A Bidjigal man was beaten to death by British soldiers for allegedly stealing potatoes, a crop that had never existed on this land before. The Eora could not comprehend it. How could anyone steal something grown on their own land? But to the British it was reason enough for violence. When the body was brought back, the Bidjigal gathered. Smoke from burning gum leaves rose like a path at a man's spirit. No one cried out loud. They only exchanged the look that history had seen many times before. It was time to settle a blood debt. Pemulwuy stood at the centre of the circle. His eyes held not rage, but something deeper. The quiet fire of the land, slow, steady, unyielding. The British do not know the law of the land, an elder said. Then we will teach them, Pemulwuy replied. That night, the Eora did not sleep. The dark bushland to the east seemed alive, breathing with the warriors preparing for their first strike in a war that would last decades. They were not many, only a few dozen, but each was a warrior guided by the spirits. Spears sharpened with silica stone as hard as steel, redwood shields painted with white markings, symbols of the ancestral beings who watched over them. Their bodies covered in white ash, not for disguise, but so the spirit of the dead man could travel with them into battle. The wind rose. Trees murmured as if warning them. Some warriors felt a chill, but they knew it was a reminder, not a threat. When Pemulwuy stepped forward, silence fell. He carried few weapons, only a bundle of spears, a woomera, and a stone blade. But the force of his presence made the forest seem to bow. He looked at each warrior, telling them without words that they fought not for themselves or their clan, but for Mother Earth. Then he laid his hand on the soil. The earth was warm, soft, alive. He closed his eyes, a long breath. When he opened them, his face had changed. He was no longer Pemulwuy the young man. He was Pemulwuy the warrior, Pemulwuy of the land. It is time, he said. We go. They moved like ghosts. Their bodies barely made a sound as they slipped through the bush, past tangled roots and thick scrub. The night forest was their domain. They knew every path, every tree, every sound. In this darkness, the British were like children lost in a labyrinth. The camp appeared ahead. White tents, dying firelight, a few men slumped over a rum keg. The moment had come. Pemulwuy raised his hand. Everything stilled. Then, in a single breath, he swung the woomera and hurled the first spear through the mist. It flew like lightning, striking the shoulder of the guard. He let out a short cry and collapsed. The other warriors surged forward. "Yana! Yana!" they shouted, the call to the ancestral spirits. Spears sliced through the air. British soldiers screamed. Muskets fired, slow and useless, for the warriors had already vanished back into the night. The raid lasted less than 2 minutes, but it shook Sydney Cove to its core. When the British regrouped, they stared in disbelief. Their attackers were not the chaotic savages they imagined. They were seasoned warriors, moving as one with the land, striking and disappearing like smoke. But what frightened them most, the man leading them did not fear guns. One survivor claimed he saw a dark-skinned man with bright eyes behind white ash holding a spear, standing only meters away without flinching at the barrel aimed at him. Like a ghost, he said. The name spread, first through the barracks, the Phantom, then through the settlements, the Ghost Warrior. Eventually, officers wrote in their reports, Pemulwuy, the colony's most dangerous threat. And in the bush, the Eora whispered that the Dreamtime had sent a sacred warrior to defend Mother Earth. One night, one small battle, but it ignited a blazing chapter in Australia's history. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight touched the surface of the sea, the place that had once been a quiet military camp was now plunged into chaos. Officers rushed about, soldiers were reloading their guns, the wounded groaned in pain. On the muddy ground, a few streaks of dried blood lay like rough lines drawn by the earth itself, marking the beginning of a war none of them had had time to imagine. At first, the British commanders did not want to believe that a group of native warriors, a people they considered primitive, could tear their camp apart in less than 2 minutes. But the reality was right in front of them. Clean, sharp wounds. Stone-tipped spears still buried in wooden posts, footprints that vanished strangely into the thick bush to the west. All of it was irrefutable evidence. And what confused them most was that name, the name the surviving sentry had mumbled before he fainted. Pemulwuy, Pemulwuy. A strange name, like the whisper of the wind. A name just enough to plant unease in their hearts. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, where sunlight only slipped through in narrow bands, Pemulwuy stood leaning against an ancient tree trunk. His body was still marked with streaks of white ash, sweat beading and running down the hard, defined lines of an Eora warrior. He felt no pride in victory. He was simply silent. For him, the previous night's raid was not glory, but a warning to the invaders that this land was not empty, not a place for anyone to simply arrive and plant a flag upon. A young warrior approached. They know your name now, the warrior said. They'll drive their troops into the bush. Pemulwuy just nodded, showing no emotion. So we pull back deeper? The warrior asked. Pemulwuy laid his hand on the tree trunk. Sap oozed beneath his fingers. He listened to the forest, the wind, the insects, the spirits shifting restlessly. No, he said quietly, the bush will shelter us, but the blood of the ancestors cannot be spilled, only for them to walk away in peace. He turned back, his eyes dark and bright like glowing coals. We still have to fight. In the days that followed, the Sydney colony seemed to fall into a nightmare. Newly cleared farms on the edges of the bush were burned. Wheat stores were destroyed in the night. Roaming livestock were killed. Not for food, but as a reminder that what the British called property was not theirs. No one saw Pemulwuy. No one heard his voice. But everyone felt him, as if he were not a man of flesh and blood, but the shadow of the forest itself, an ancient spirit moving through every thicket. The British sent out a pursuit party, their best men, their best weapons, but all they found were traces that made their skin crawl, footprints on damp earth, then gone among tangled roots, spear marks lodged in tree trunks at incredible heights, strange symbols drawn in black charcoal on rock. No one understood their meaning, but everyone felt watched. A young soldier in the pursuit party said, I feel like the bush is watching us. No one laughed, no one argued, because they all felt the same. The nights in the Australian bush back then were not for the faint-hearted. Trees towered like prehistoric figures, overlapping to form a dark canopy. The rustling of animals in the scrub set every soldier on edge. torchlight trembled, yellow and weak, as if it could go out at any moment. And in the midst of all that, they still could not find any real trace of the man they were hunting. One night, as the pursuit party crept tensely across slow ground, a whistling sound rang out, as soft as wind through leaves, yet it froze them in place. "What was that?" a soldier whispered. The commander signalled for silence. Then they heard it, a light, steady tapping. 3 beats, then 3 beats again. An Aboriginal man who had once worked as an interpreter for them spoke quietly, his face pale. "A signal. They're surrounding us." Before they could react, a spear flew in and struck the torch dead on, snuffing out their only source of light. The forest swallowed them in darkness. Gunshots cracked wildly. Screams rang out and then were cut short. The footsteps of Aboriginal warriors moved lightly over dry branches, fast, rhythmic, precise. Some claimed they met Pemulwuy's eyes in the dark, just for a heartbeat, but that glance was enough to make them forget how to breathe. It was not the gaze of a senseless killer. It was the gaze of a man protecting sacred land, a man who saw this war as his duty. When dawn came, only half the pursuit party remained. The survivors said they never clearly saw their attackers, but could feel his presence above them, beside them, right behind them, as if Pemulwuy could pass through the trees themselves. And then a rumour began to spread through the camp. That one is not a man. That one cannot be killed. That one is the spirit of the bush. No officer fully believed it, but none of them stamped it out, because deep down even the highest ranking among them had begun to tremble at that name. Pemulwuy. Out in the bush, the Eora kept speaking his name in night ceremonies. Pemulwuy, man of Mother Earth. Pemulwuy, spear of the dreamtime. Pemulwuy, darkness upon the invader. But no war is made only of victories. And then the inevitable happened. On a day of heavy rain in 1797, Pemulwuy led a group of warriors towards the Toongabbie area, where the British had built many farms and large grain stores. To him, destroying this place was not just strategy, but a way to restore balance to the land. British wheat had sprung up on stolen ground, draining the life from country that had once been sacred hunting ground. But the British were ready. As the Aboriginal warriors advanced, more than 40 British soldiers lay hidden in the tall sorghum, muskets at the ready. Gunfire cracked like thunder. One bullet tore through Pemulwuy's shoulder, another lodged in his stomach, a third smashed into his thigh. He fell to the earth amid the pounding rain and the chaos of shouts. His warriors dragged him back into the bush while the British were certain they had finally killed the ghost. They returned to the camp and reported that Pemulwuy had taken multiple bullets to the body and could not possibly have survived. But they were wrong. In a deep rock shelter in the Darawal bush, Eora warriors gathered around Pemulwuy's fallen body. His blood soaked into the ground, mingling with the smell of rain, wet timber, and the ancient presence of the spirit figures painted on the cave ceiling generations before. Healers used ash, leaves, and tree sap to staunch the bleeding. They blew breath over his wounds as if sending power from the dreamtime. They did not know if he would live, but they knew he could not die like an ordinary man. And that was how it was. After many weeks on the knife edge between life and death, Pemulwuy opened his eyes. His gaze had not dimmed. It had not been hollowed out by the darkness. On the contrary, it was stronger than before, as if every bullet that had torn through him had only made his spirit burn brighter. A warrior asked, "You're still alive. How can you live through those wounds?" Pemulwuy looked up at the rock ceiling where the rainbow serpent curved as if it were still moving, and spoke slowly. "Because Mother Earth has not allowed me to leave." News that Pemulwuy had survived spread like lightning. From small clans to distant travelling groups, then to British ears. And that was when they began to call him by the name later generations would remember. The man who cannot die. The man who cannot be killed. And from that day on, the war stepped into a new chapter, bloodier, deeper and greater. A chapter in which Pemulwuy was no longer just a warrior, but a symbol of a people who refused to disappear. A symbol of a land that could rise against an empire. A symbol of a strength that even Western guns could not crush. And what was to come after that could only be called by one name. The rise of the immortal phantom. Winter rain had passed. The Eora forests wore a light mist like a thin silver shawl, shimmering under the cold moonlight. The air was so still you could clearly hear droplets falling from eucalyptus leaves onto the soft ground. But within that stillness, something was shifting. Something was waking. The Eora called it the breath of the earth. And that night, that breath was hotter, stronger, prouder, because the warrior they thought had fallen forever was rising, stronger than when he was wounded. Pemulwuy stepped out of the rock cave where he had been hiding for many weeks. Moonlight swept over his scarred body. The wounds from British bullets still marked him, a long line across his shoulder, a hollow at his belly, a darkened streak on his thigh. But these were not the marks of a defeated man. They were the badges of one who had returned from death. Each wound was a testimony. He had faced the mightiest empire on earth, and he was still standing. The young warriors looked at him with eyes full of both awe and sacred fear. They believed the rainbow serpent protected him. They believed he carried a piece of the ancestors' spirit within him. And deep in every heart there was a belief no one dared speak aloud. If Pemulwuy could not die, then this war would never end. News of Pemulwuy's survival reached the British camp faster than the sea breeze carrying salt from Botany Bay. When he heard the report, one officer scoffed. Impossible. No one survives 3 close-range shots. But when the colony doctor examined the bullet fragments taken from the bodies of other Aboriginal people, he only shook his head, his face draining of colour. If this man was hit in those places, then there's no explanation. Soon enough, rumour turned into a quiet terror, seeping into meal times, into night watches, into every silence between patrols. He's a demon. He has magic. He came from the earth. Bullets can't kill him. No one knew the truth. But everyone believed one thing. Pemulwuy would return. And he did. That night, a group of soldiers slept in the timber barracks west of Parramatta. They had not yet shaken off the memory of the brutal ambush weeks earlier. Some still trembled when they heard the wind whistle through cracks in the walls. Others prayed before sleep, a thing they had never done back in England. None of them knew that in the darkness at the edge of the bush, only a few hundred metres away, someone was watching. Pemulwuy looked at the camp as if looking at a wound on the body of Mother Earth. His gaze was cold, but not the cold of steel. It was the calm cold of a sacred duty, one he had carried since childhood, since the elders had told him he was the child marked by the dream time. Behind him, dozens of warriors stood waiting in silence. No one spoke, but all eyes were fixed on him like he was the flame they were about to follow into the night. Pemulwuy raised his hand. He did not signal a spear throw. He did not signal a charge. He simply raised his hand, then placed it on the ground. Every warrior understood at once. Strike not with brute force, but with silence. They did not attack the heart of the camp. They struck at the lifeblood of the British. Grain, crops, livestock, wells, everything that kept them alive. The next morning, as the mist thinned, the British discovered the entire farming area had been destroyed. Wheat was trampled into circles like part of a ritual. Stones had been thrown into the wells, making them useless. Wooden walls were pierced with deep holes, not enough to bring them down, but like a message carved into them. We know you are here, and we can come whenever we choose. An officer shouted at his men, "Tell me, did any of you see anyone?" But the soldiers only lowered their heads. No one had seen anything. Pemulwuy had left no trace, no breath, no footsteps, as if he did not walk on human feet, but on the breath of the forest. The war was no longer just a string of battles. It had become a psychological game, one the British could not win. In guerrilla war, whoever owns the ground owns the future. The British had guns. The British had powder. The British had thick coats, forts, iron discipline. But the Eora had something no gun could break. They had the bush. Month after month, the fighting did not stop. Every time the British thought they finally held the upper hand, Pemulwuy appeared again, in the place they least expected, at the time they were least prepared, in ways they could not fathom. Once, he and a few warriors crept close to the area near Sydney Cove and burned the timber sheds used to store food. Strangely, they came and went like shadows. The sentry swore he saw a man standing before the flames, eyes blazing, then vanishing into the night. "Impossible," the commander barked. "Maybe he slipped into the scrub?" "No, sir," the soldier replied, face ghost pale. "He disappeared, like a shadow." No one knew that on that very night Pemulwuy stood on a rocky outcrop, watching the flames roar through the British camp, watching them glow like the beating heart of the Dreamtime coming back to life. And he spoke softly, "Not for anyone else to hear, only for the earth. I do not fight for vengeance. I fight for you." The Eora believed that when a warrior spoke to the land would protect him. Perhaps that was why he was never captured. But every kind of immortality has a price. Once, after a raid near Toongabbie, Pemulwuy returned to camp with his arm bleeding again. A young warrior ran towards him. "They've hit you again." Pemulwuy let out a quiet laugh, just the corner of his mouth lifting like a passing breeze. "It's nothing." "Nothing?" the young man shouted. "You're not stone. You're not a spirit." But Pemulwuy only looked at him, his gaze softening. "I am not immortal," he said. "I have simply not yet been allowed to die." The young warrior stepped back, heart pounding. It was the first time many had heard Pemulwuy speak that way. He did not claim to be deathless. He did not deny the sacredness around him. He simply acknowledged one truth. He survived not because his body was strong, but because his task was not yet complete. A task greater than one man's life. When the dry season returned, Pemulwuy changed tactics. He struck at supply convoys travelling from Parramatta to Sydney, plunging the British into serious shortages. They could not understand how heavily guarded carts still fell into ambushes. They could not understand how Pemulwuy always knew exactly when a convoy left the camp. One officer said, "That man has eyes and ears everywhere." But the truth was far simpler. Pemulwuy had no spies. Pemulwuy had the bush. The bush spoke to him. The earth spoke to him. The wind spoke to him. Every sound, every footprint, every bird taking flight from a shrub was a signal. An old warrior said, "Pemulwuy does not walk in the forest walks with Pemulwuy." By then, the British had begun to realise they were not just facing a band of Aboriginal warriors. They were up against a born guerrilla leader, a man who could see through their tactics, turn everything around him into an advantage, and never fought in a way the British Army had been trained to counter. They issued a warrant for Pemulwuy, dead or alive. A hefty reward. Promises of promotion, power, but no one came forward. No one dared, and this terrified the British more than musket fire. Even among those who might have wished to betray him, none dared hunt him. For the Aboriginal people believed that whoever killed Pemulwuy would be punished by the ancestors, and the British believed he could not be killed. One summer night, with the moon hanging in the sky like a cold white eye, Pemulwuy slipped once more around Prospect Camp, home of some of the hardest soldiers. This time he did not attack. He only wanted to watch, and as he stood on a hill watching the silhouettes of soldiers moving in the firelight, he understood something. This war would not end quickly. It was not a 1-year fight, not even a 10-year fight. It was a war of will, of spirit, of two worlds that could not share the same sacred ground. He looked towards distant Sydney Cove, where British lights shone like the sharp teeth of a predator sunk into the belly of the land. And he knew he was the only one who could stand in their way, no matter the cost. He walked down the hill. His body melted into the darkness, and the bush once more swallowed him, like a mother drawing her child back into her arms. From then on, the name Pemulwuy was no longer just the name of a man. It became fear, hope, a battle cry, a curse of the land, and a symbol of a war that would only burn fiercer, a war moving towards its decisive moment. Because the phantom that could not be killed had returned to lead the storm. The dry season nights in New South Wales always had a very particular colour, the sky high and clear like a black mirror, the full moon hanging there like the eye of an ancestral spirit being, and the wind blowing in long streams carrying the scent of red dust, eucalyptus and untold things. It was the kind of night when the old people in the clans warned their children not to go out, because Dreamtime spirits walked in the dark, bringing messages only the chosen could understand. And that night, those messages were meant for Pemulwuy. In the vast eucalyptus forest, a group of Eora warriors sat around a small fire, its light flickering across their faces, smeared with white ash, streaked with red, painted with the symbols of the ancestors. No one spoke. They simply waited. The wind blew. Leaves whispered. Then, out of the darkness, Pemulwuy stepped forward. The whole group rose to their feet, not out of fear, but out of a reverence that was almost religious. This man did not walk like ordinary people. He moved as if the night itself were parting before him, as if the trees were shifting aside to clear his path. His body was covered in scars, wounds the British believed were fatal, yet here he stood, eyes burning like the last embers in a fire pit. A young warrior, newly joined to the guerrilla band, even dropped to his knees. But Pemulwuy gestured for him to rise. He did not want anyone bowing to him. The only thing Aboriginal people bowed to was the earth. The other warriors stood in a circle as he spoke a single line, his voice low but carrying. The British no longer want small wars. They want to wipe us out. Tension spread across every face. Everyone knew it was true. After a string of raids, burnt camps, destroyed depots, broken supply lines, the British no longer saw Pemulwuy as a mere troublemaker. He had become enemy number one of the entire colony. They had failed to capture him. They had seen him live through multiple gunshots. They had watched his guerrilla force grow like a dry blaze fanned by the wind. And now they were preparing to unleash a force unlike anything before. The next morning at Sydney Cove, Colonel David Collins assembled all commanding officers in a small square inside the camp. Horses stamped on the hard, dry ground. British red flags snapped in the sea breeze. The sun glinted off polished muskets as if the British were preparing for a parade, not a war on someone else's land. Collins had received orders from his superiors in London. Pacify the rebellious savages. He did not yet know that those words, pacify them, would become one of the most difficult commands of his career. He said just one thing in front of the assembled ranks. We will hunt him, hunt until he takes his last breath. An old soldier gripped his weapon tighter, but no one noticed that his hand was trembling. He had seen comrades killed in the dark, attacked from behind, speared through the throat in their sleep. And the name Pemulwuy, a name he was not supposed to fear, had become a shadow that followed him into every dream. The pursuit force was divided into multiple units, spreading in 4 directions. Parramatta, George's River, Toongabbie Kemp, and the southern forests of Eora Nation. The British believed that with enough numbers, victory would come. What they didn't understand was they were walking into Pemulwuy's world. In the days that followed, the forest seemed to slip into a strange state. Birds fell silent. Animals changed their paths. Water in the low pools flowed slower. The old ones said the land was holding its breath, waiting for something big. Pemulwuy stood on a rise, looking down at the lowlands where hundreds of British soldiers were sweeping through. He watched them the way you might watch ants scatter from a broken nest. Numerous, noisy, impressive in number, but devoid of any real understanding of the country they were trampling through. He turned to those beside him. This is no longer small war. This is a war for survival. A warrior asked. Do we strike them, or pull back deeper? Pemulwuy looked at the ground beneath his feet. Mother Earth will not let us retreat. The land wants an answer. The biggest confrontation between Pemulwuy and the British forces came in the wider Toongabbie bush. The British set traps, laid ambushes, stationed cavalry at every opening, and hid riflemen in the high scrub. They wanted to force Pemulwuy into a net he could not escape. But Pemulwuy knew beforehand. He always knew beforehand. As the Eora guerrilla band approached the tree line, Pemulwuy raised his hand for a halt. He listened. Others heard nothing unusual, just wind, leaves, birds. But he heard something only he could hear, an oddness in the land's breathing. Someone's watching, he said quietly. The bush is warning us. He signalled a withdrawal. The warriors vanished as if they had never been there. When the British had waited and waited without seeing anyone, they grew impatient and stepped out from their hiding places. That was when Pemulwuy struck, but not head on. He led his men around behind their line, attacking the ammunition store, the heart of the powder supply for the entire operation. One sharp spear, one spark from a flint, and the fire leapt up like a starving beast. The magazine exploded, the blast echoing for kilometres. The ground shook, birds exploded up from the trees. British soldiers stumbled, screaming from their tents, their cries mixing with the wind like desperate prayers. In the chaos, Pemulwuy stood on a small rocky outcrop, looking down at the roaring column of flame. Firelight washed across his face, turning him into a living statue of the Dreamtime, half flesh, half spirit. A British soldier saw him from afar, eyes wide. He's standing in the fire. He's not a man. He's a demon. But Pemulwuy only watched them flee, then turned away and left as quietly as he had arrived. The next morning, the Colonial force sent its report back to headquarters. Severe losses. Powder magazine destroyed. Many men dead in panic and confusion. Native ringleader Pemulwuy escaped as usual. But what frightened the officers more than his skill in battle was his silence. Pemulwuy never left threats, never sent messages, never boasted of his victories. To the British, that silence was the most terrifying thing of all. A threat can be measured. Silence is a bottomless pit. The war dragged on, night after night, month after month. Then something began to happen, something the British had never expected. Other clans began to rise, not just Bidjigal, not just Eora. News of Pemulwuy spread far, like rumours of a man who could not die, a survivor of lead bullets, a warrior shielded by the Dreamtime. The Doon, the Darug, and even Darawal people started sending warriors to meet him. Small groups from the south sent up night fire signals. The old ones retold the story of the warrior with the cloudy eye and turned in foot, bearing sacred marks. Pemulwuy was no longer just a leader. He had become a symbol, a flame in the long colonial night. And when warriors from many clans gathered in the Eora bush, when they stood side by side, ash across their chests, stone spears in hand, firelight dancing in their eyes, Pemulwuy knew. This was no longer the war of one clan. This was the war of a people. He stepped onto a high rock, looking out at the hundreds of warriors from many different countries. No king, no nation, no treaties. Yet they stood here under the same moon, together, for one thing only: Mother Earth. Pemulwuy raised his spear. He did not roar. He did not shout. He simply lifted it, and the wind carried his will through the forest. "We fight," he said, "not to kill, but to remember that the ancestors never left us." And the Eora roared their oldest battle cry, a call to the spirits. Ya na, ya na. That cry rolled through the night bush, echoing off trees, rocks, caves, like 1,000 voices answering back. It was the moment the British could never have imagined they had caused. They had not only wounded one clan, they had stirred the Dreamtime itself. For a heartbeat, the wind rushed hard through the forest, and every Eora there believed it was the ancestors breathing. The war was not over. The war was swelling like a storm, for the immortal phantom had become the beating heart of an entire resistance. And before them, there was only one path left, a blood and fire path towards the final battle. A path the British would never forget. A path Pemulwuy, the deathless one, would follow to the very end. The night wind carried the first chill of the season, slipping past the trunks of the eucalypts like spirits searching for their way home. The moon hung in the sky, strangely full and bright, shining down on a land left panting after months of bloodshed and clashes. The wounds of the forest, charred trunks, torn up hollows, trampled grass, all looked like injuries on the shared body of the Dreamtime. And in the middle of it all, Pemulwuy stood alone. No warriors stood at his side now. They wanted to follow him, to protect him, to go with him into the final battle. But Pemulwuy had ordered them to stop. "This is not the war you must die in with me," he had said, his voice so deep the forest itself fell quiet to listen. A young warrior burst into tears. "You're our symbol. If we lose you..." Pemulwuy placed his scarred hand on the boy's shoulder, his eyes older than the ancient trees. "Symbols do not die. Only the ones who carry them die, and it is time I took that part." The young warrior wiped his tears, but dared not argue. Pemulwuy turned away and walked into the deepest dark of the forest, where only the wind followed him. In the past months, the British had become like a hunted animal driven to madness. They could not catch him, could not stop his attacks, could not understand how he moved, could not explain his miraculous survival. They tried everything: cutting off water sources, laying traps along tracks, using native trackers as guides, forming special mounted units, putting a bounty on his head larger than any before. All of it failed. But one thing had changed. They no longer saw Pemulwuy as a nuisance. They saw him as the leader of a full-scale war against the colony. The colonial authorities made their decision: either capture him or destroy him, at any cost. At first light, thick fog wrapped the land south of Sydney. British soldiers had been lying in ambush for 2 days around a stretch of bush they believed Pemulwuy would cross. No one spoke, no one slept, and no one admitted how afraid they were, their hands sweating on the muskets they gripped. One officer whispered, "If he really is a spirit, tonight we die." Another replied, "If he's a man, he'll show himself." They did not know that in the darkness not far away, Pemulwuy was watching them. He stood perched on a large branch, higher than any soldier's line of sight. The white ash on his skin caught the moonlight like a spirit's armour. The wind stirred his hair like a flame teased by air. He did not tremble. He did not rage. He was simply calm, as if he knew this was not his end, but the beginning of something larger. Pemulwuy dropped to the ground, light as a bird's shadow. Then he stepped out of the forest and stood straight in front of the line of soldiers aiming their guns. No hiding, no cover, no step back. He walked out like a warrior stepping out of legend. A long moment, longer than the whole forest's breath. The British soldiers froze. He's appeared. This can't be real. The commanding officer screamed, swallowed by fear. Fire. Gunshots ripped the air apart. Bullets cut through the dark. Dust flew. And Pemulwuy fell. No cry. No groan. No hint of fear. He fell like an ancient tree collapsing after its final storm. The forest went silent. The youngest soldier stepped forward, his hands shaking around his musket. He wanted to be sure this was real, that the man who could not die had finally gone down. As he drew near, the moon lit Pemulwuy's face. His eyes were open, no anger, no fear, no resentment. Only one thing. The absolute peace of someone who had finished his task. The young soldier staggered back, breathing hard. He looked at me like he already knew this would happen. The officer rasped, "He's not a god, just a man." But that same officer, when he bent to look at Pemulwuy's body, murmured a line no one else quite heard. "Just a man. Why does he look like a god?" News of Pemulwuy's death tore through the clans like a bolt of lightning, but there were no cries. The Eora did not weep for a warrior. They sang. The spirit songs rose from the southern sands, from forest edges, from deep caves. They sang the songs their ancestors had sung when their totem beings returned to the dreamtime. They believed Pemulwuy had not died. He had simply gone back where he belonged, back to Mother Earth, back to the spirits, back into stories that would outlive time itself. But the British did something no one expected. They cut off his head. They sent it to England as proof of victory. And yet that head vanished from history. No one knows where it went. No one has ever found it. As if even the last piece of his body refused to be locked up, refused to be studied, refused to be displayed. The Eora elders said, "Mother Earth has taken back what remained of him." Many years later, when elders told stories around the fire, they did not say that Pemulwuy was killed. They said, "Pemulwuy returned to the earth. His spirit travels with the wind, with the water, with the trees. He is not dead. He is waiting." They said that whenever a strong wind rushes through the night bush, that is Pemulwuy walking among the branches. Whenever a black bird flies across sacred country, that is Pemulwuy carrying messages to the ancestors. Whenever the full moon shines brighter than usual, that is Pemulwuy peeking into the world of the living. He was not an immortal man. He was not just a spirit. He was a memory that could not be killed. 2 centuries have passed. The British have gone. The colony has changed. Sydney has become a city of buildings rising over old country. But deep beneath that ground, in the ancient layers of soil, the marks of the dreamtime remain, the traces of old footsteps, and somewhere in the stories of modern Aboriginal people, the shadow of one man still appears. A man with a cloudy eye. A man who lived through lead bullets. A man who stood alone before an imperial army. A man who fought not for power, but for Mother Earth. A man immortal in the memory of his people. Pemulwuy, the warrior who could not be killed. The symbol of the land. The voice of the ancestors. The flame that never goes out in the forest. His life ended in a dark night. But his story was only beginning. The last embers of the night fire slowly faded, leaving a faint veil of smoke drifting through the Eora forest. The story of Pemulwuy closed like a torn page of history, full of loss yet blazing bright like lightning ripping across the sky. He had fallen, but the flame he lit continued to burn in the heart of Mother Earth, carried by wind, carried by water, spreading even to distant lands the British had yet to reach. For the struggle of the Aboriginal people did not end in Sydney. It was only changing shape. Far to the south, where heavy mist wrapped the cold forests of Tasmania, another storm was gathering. There, the Palawa peoples were facing a tragedy, greater and more brutal, a conflict the world would later only dare to speak of through a shadowed name. The Black War. A war not fought only with spears and guns, but with despair, with relentless hunting, and with nameless ghosts. And that will be the story of the next chapter.